Okay, I'm going to kind of cover quite a bit of Karsh's life, really, in some ways, and I don't usually read off notes, but I'm going to because I really didn't want to miss anything, so bear with me. I bought a couple of books along, and I've actually cribbed some stories and what have you from those books, so I'm quoting various people here. In this particular instance, from the book Regarding Heroes, a gentleman named David Travis, who's a curator, wrote the following. Yousuf Karsh's lifelong ambition was to search for a form within a face, one that could become a symbol for a life that was purposeful, meaningful, and genuinely virtuous. In his 60-year career, he seldom wavered from this goal, even when fame and fortune came his way. Neither did he discard his trademark variations in lighting style that he perfected in the late 1940s, while other fashions came and went. Unchanging, too, was his genius at capturing the revealing and ephemeral psychological expressions, those fleeting disclosures of character and purpose for which his famous sitters trusted him. He was the preferred photographer of kings and queens, princes, presidents, prime ministers, generals, and other political figures because he rendered them with an unbiased and unfailing regard for their dignity. With musicians, artists, writers, scientists, actors, and other creative intellectuals, he shared a parallel ambition to create works of art of lasting value. In making what now seems singular, monumental statements honoring those he considered his contemporary heroes, he stood alone in his field, so much so that it could be argued he was the last of his kind. During his career, Karsh held over 15,000 sittings and produced over 150,000 negatives. After he died in 2002, Mrs. Karsh decided to select a new agent to represent the archive in North America. I was running the Retina photo agency at the time, and one day I answered the phone to my colleague in London at Camera Press. Camera Press had been Karsh's agent since he met its founder, Tom Blau, in London in the 1940s. I was instructed to remove my nose ring, put on a suit, take the train to Boston, where I would have tea with Mrs. Karsh. I left my nose ring in, I put on my best Armani, and I went to Boston, and I fell in love with Mrs. Karsh. When I left the photo agency in 2006, Mrs. Karsh came with me, and she's now the only person I represent for licensing. There are many, many joys that go along with working with the outstanding Mrs. Karsh and our wonderful curator and director, Jerry Fielder. And I also regularly hear wonderful stories from ordinary people who were photographed by Karsh or from relatives of his subjects, or people who simply met and were entranced by him and his wife. And as you know, I'm here today because of Deborah's experience with Karsh herself, which is a great story. I knew very little about Karsh when Camera Press called me, and all these years later, I'm still learning. I do not profess to be an expert on his life or on his techniques, but I've tried my best to encapsulate his career and share some of what I do on a daily basis in his name. So I'm actually in the process of sourcing images for this book, which is coming out in the fall, and it's given me some further insight into how a very lowly Yousuf Karsh, about 18 or 19 in this picture, came to be Karsh of Ottawa. This is from Jerry Fielder's introduction in this new book. Yousuf Karsh was born to Armenian parents on December 23rd, 1908 in Mardin, Turkey. Just 7 years later, the massacre began when over 1 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were killed in what later became known as the Armenian Genocide. Life was tenuous for the Karsh family and food was scarce. Each morning, they awoke unsure of what might happen and whether they would survive another day. Karsh's sister died a gruesome death, and 2 of his uncles were murdered. In 1922, the Ottoman government gave the Karsh family permission to leave the country. They were ordered to dispose of their remaining possessions and to leave the doors of their home open, never to return. They spent a difficult 29 days traveling by caravan to Aleppo in Syria. They had their freedom, but the price was high. It meant literally starting over with nothing. In 1924, the family was eventually able to send Yousuf Karsh, who was to become known for a while as Joe, for expediency probably, to join his uncle George Nakash, who was a photographer in Sherbrooke in Quebec. This is a self-portrait. He assisted his uncle in the studio, and soon after he started working with the cameras and the processing chemicals, he became fascinated with photography in general and portraiture in particular. As Karsh's interest developed, Uncle Nakash gave him an inexpensive camera with which he could experiment. It was with this camera that he took landscape in 1927, his earliest photograph still in existence. Karsh presented a print of this study to a friend who had been kind to him. Without informing Karsh, the friend entered the print in a photography contest, and it won first place, which gave a cash prize of $50, which was no small sum in 1927. More important than the monetary award, the recognition gave Karsh a newfound confidence in his work. At the same time, his uncle realized that Karsh deserved greater opportunities to nurture his talent. Wanting to expand his nephew's options, Nakash corresponded with his good friend John H. Garrow in Boston, and in 1928, Karsh moved yet again to another country, the United States, age 19. Karsh was to apprentice for 6 months with this great master of photography. Those few months turned into 3 years, which profoundly changed the accomplished and influential lives of both men. On the left is a portrait by Garrow from 1915 and a 1936 portrait by Karsh of an actress named Betty Lowe, dancer. She's still alive. I've met her. She's fabulous. So Garrow was working in Boston in the late 19th century and early 20th century. He was really well known in his day. And here he is, fabulous character himself. So this is actually John Garrow by Karsh. Besides technical development, the young, impressionable, and eager Yousuf Karsh would learn about high society and its customs when John Garrow closed his daylight studio at 4 p.m. each day. They had skylights and blinds, and they used to basically only work during the daytime, so come 4 o'clock in the afternoon, cameras would go away, and people would start to arrive. And here's a quote from the biography here by a woman named Maria Tippett, which I highly recommend. He transformed his palatial reception rooms into a salon, a meeting place for the city's cultural elite. It was simply known that after 4 p.m., anyone who wanted good food, good drink, difficult to find during Prohibition, and good talk, they could find it at Garrow's studio. Karsh learned a lot there. Returning to Ottawa in 1931, Karsh was faced with a recession and xenophobia. He was to struggle hard for 4 years. And as he sought to establish himself, he began photographing at the Ottawa Little Theatre. So he really began to cut his teeth more and began to understand different types of lighting from working with the theatre. Romeo and Juliet. Can't remember what that's from. Not only did he meet Ottawa's most illustrious citizens at the Ottawa Little Theatre, but he was to meet his future wife, actress Solange Gauthier. And Solange would become Karsh's right hand, ensuring that Karsh photographed every personality who passed through Ottawa until her early death in 1961. And here she is in her fabulousness. Solange. Beautiful. Karsh would then go on to marry my now dear friend Estrelita Karsh, and Estrelita would also prove instrumental in Mr. Karsh's career. So I'm going to take a little interlude and show you just some fun snaps that I thought people would appreciate. So this is Estrelita and Yousuf Karsh by Edward Steichen. And here's Karsh taking a picture of Estrelita and Edward. And that's the picture they're taking. So I just found this, actually. I hadn't seen it before. Nice. And there's the four of them hanging out, you know, like you do. Anyone know who that is? Hemingway, Havana. Jacques Lipschitz. There's lots of these great things where someone either made a bust of Yousuf or Estrelita and they have a picture of them in the studio. It's all fabulous. One of my favorites, this is the Khrushchevs, Moscow. Aww. Yep. Mm-hmm. I think they used this photograph on his the card at his funeral. Henson. And Ronnie, yucking it up with Ronnie. And just a bonus picture, so Karsh with his mom and his brothers, they'd all eventually make it over to Canada. Okay, a little brief break there for you. All right, so no one's going to know who this is unless they're Canadian. Any Canadians in the house?
Pearson?
Nope. This is William Lyon Mackenzie King. So through connections that Karsh made at the theatre, he was to meet the Canadian Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King. Mackenzie King dominated Canadian politics from the 1920s through the 1940s, and he was the major advocate in Karsh's initial rise to international recognition. They first met in the summer of 1936, when Karsh photographed King. In the background, Lord Tweedsmuir, also known as John Buchan, on the left there, with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt's son James on a visit to Quebec City. This journalistic photograph pleased Mackenzie King, and he pledged his support to Karsh. I go back to this face. Karsh made several attempts to take an engaging portrait of Mr. King. The Prime Minister was overly concerned about how history would see him and was unable to offer any more than an immobile, formal face to his favourite photographer. However, he was less self-conscious with his dog, and Karsh had better success with snapshots of the politician relaxing on his estate. Years later, it was King who allowed Karsh to secretly set up his lights in the Speaker's chamber to secure a portrait of Winston Churchill after his stirring address to a joint session of the Canadian Parliament on December 30th, 1941. This was the photograph that almost instantly made Karsh internationally famous, but another little sidestep. So a bunch of images that people do not necessarily associate with Karsh. This is actually a box of straws that he was picking at and began to resemble New York. One of my personal favorites of his early photographs. And he did a lot of industrial work too. There's a whole book just of industrial images, in fact, mostly made in Canada. And he was also, basic assignment guy, photographed, I think this is from a series of Halifax in Nova Scotia that he'd made for Maclean's on one of those Canadian mags. One of the most sexy pictures. This is Ford of Canada. They own a lot of the work that Karsh did there, and we do grant them rights to use stuff and exhibit the work. So aside to Karsh, perhaps some of you don't know. He's pretty talented. Oh, I would also never seen this one until recently. And as Deborah was talking about earlier, he photographed the posters for the Muscular Dystrophy Association every year, and I thought that was a sweet one. Okay, now I'm going to give you some stories, because no one's laughing yet. So here we go. Let's see what we can do. Who knows the Churchill story?
The cigar. Yeah.
Who thinks it's true? Come on, one of you thinks, okay. Well, on our website, there's actually a really entertaining video of Yousuf Karsh with Morley Safer in the Canadian Chambers, and they recreate the photograph. So if you have time, go on the website and take a look at that. I'm going to tell you the whole story. Some of you don't seem to even know it, and it's pretty wonderful. So, Winston Churchill's just given an incredible speech, and it's there in his pocket. And this is a quote from Karsh himself. "My portrait of Winston Churchill changed my life. I knew after I had taken it that it was an important picture, but I could hardly have dreamed that it would become one of the most widely reproduced images in the history of photography. In 1941, Churchill visited first Washington and then Ottawa. The Prime Minister Mackenzie King invited me to be present. After the electrifying speech, I waited in the Speaker's chamber where the evening before I had set up my lights and camera. The Prime Minister, arm in arm with Churchill and followed by his entourage, started to lead him into the room. I switched on my floodlights. A surprised Churchill growled, 'What's this? What's this?' No one had the courage to explain. I timorously stepped forward and said, "Sir, I hope I will be fortunate enough to make a portrait worthy of this historic occasion." He glanced at me and demanded, "Why was I not told?" When his entourage began to laugh, this hardly helped matters for me. Churchill lit a fresh cigar, puffed at it with a mischievous air, and then magnanimously relented. "You may take one." Churchill's cigar was ever present. I held out an ashtray, but he would not dispose of it. I went back to my camera and made sure everything was all right technically. I waited. He continued to chomp vigorously at his cigar. I waited. Then I stepped toward him and, without premeditation but ever so respectfully, I said, "Forgive me, sir," and I plucked the cigar out of his mouth. By the time I got back to my camera, he looked so belligerent he could have devoured me. It was at that instant that I took the photograph. And then he relaxed. So onwards with the stories. That's what I'm doing. One of my all-time favorites. Anyone? Shaw, George Bernard Shaw. I kind of went a little chronological, and I don't want to bore you, so I've only got a few stories. 1943, George Bernard Shaw, a real character and a half. And this again is in Karsh's voice, obviously. Every obstacle was in my way when I first met George Bernard Shaw in 1943. To begin with, his secretary had laid down drastic and quite impossible terms. I was to have 5 minutes only with the great man. There were to be no lights. I could use nothing but a miniature camera. While I was arguing vainly, Shaw himself came bursting into the room with the energy of a young man, though he was then about 90 years old. His manner, his penetrating old eyes, his bristling beard, and crisp speech were all designed to awe me, and in the beginning, he succeeded. After he had tested me with preliminary horror, we got along beautifully. Later on, a noted British journalist asked me to prepare a copy of this picture, which he proposed to have autographed by Shaw. To his chagrin, he received the picture back with Shaw's signature scrawled on the back of it. When asked for an explanation, Shaw replied, "I was careful to make sure that my signature should not distract from my face." Nothing could, I think, distract from that face. I put in a couple bonuses too, so we've got the really iconic images, and there's often one or two others that people don't see so much. Anyone? This will be a tough one. H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells photographed. Well, this was the way Wells greeted me. "I hear that you've been photographing Shaw. It's a great mistake. When future generations go through the ruins of London, they will find Shaw, and still more Shaw photographs, and the unfortunate thing is that they will take him to be the typical Englishman." I smiled. "There's nothing funny about it," said H.G. "It's horrible and true." I hastened to explain. His remark reminded me of two American radio comedians, Fred Allen and Jack Benny. "I know them," retorted Mr. Wells, "and I don't imagine they originated public feuding. Shaw and I have been at it almost 50 years. No need to ask who this is. 1948. Not such well, among the tasks that life as a photographer had set me, a portrait of Albert Einstein had always seemed a must. Not only because the greatest refugee of our century has been accounted by all the world as the most outstanding scientist since Newton, but because his face, in all its rough grandeur, invited and challenged the camera. At Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, I found Einstein a simple, kindly, almost childlike man, too great for any of the postures of eminence. One did not have to understand his science to feel the power of his mind or the force of his personality. He spoke sadly, yet serenely, as one who had looked into the universe, far past mankind's small affairs. When I asked him what the world would be like were another atomic bomb to be dropped, he replied wearily, "Alas, we will no longer be able to hear the music of Mozart." This is a French author named Francois Mauriac, another one of my personal favourite portraits, and a cracking story too. So it is quite absurd. I speak with strong conviction and somewhat bitter experience to say that the French are a decadent race. How can they be, when so many of them climb 6 flights of stairs several times a day? Indeed, most of the great Frenchmen I have photographed have chosen to live on the 6th floor or higher without an elevator. Since Monsieur Mauriac could not be asked to come down from his Olympian heights, I and my assistant were compelled to ascend with all our heavy equipment in several breathtaking climbs. And then, after all the wires had been connected, there was no electricity. While we waited for the power to be turned back on in Paris, he talked freely on many subjects of a philosophical sort. I deliberately needled him a bit on his familiar journalistic feud with Sartre and the existentialists, that were then the prevailing fad in France. On the off chance of success, I posed my subject before an open French door and against the greyness of the Paris skies. My assistant removed a sheet from the bed and held it up as a reflector. Okay, no prizes for knowing this one. Okay, you can all have a candy. 1954, a tricky subject, I believe. People mostly found him. The maestro's villa was a photographer's nightmare, with his boisterous children bicycling through vast rooms already crowded with canvases. I eagerly accepted Picasso's alternate suggestion to meet later at his ceramic gallery. "He will never be here," the gallery owner commented, when my assistant and 200 pounds of equipment arrived. He says the same thing to every photographer. To everyone's amazement, the old lion not only kept his photographic appointment with me, but was prompt and wore a new shirt. He could partially view himself in my large format lens and intuitively moved to complete the composition. Here he is. There's a lot of story about Hemingway, so I picked a little bit. I expected to meet in the author a composite of the heroes of his novels. Instead, in 1957, at his home near Havana, I found a man of peculiar gentleness, the shyest man I ever photographed, a man cruelly battered by life, but seemingly invincible. He was still suffering from the effects of a plane accident that occurred during his 4th safari to Africa. I had gone the evening before to La Floridita, Hemingway's favorite bar, to do my homework and sample his favorite concoction, the daiquiri. But one can be over-prepared. When at 9 the next morning, Hemingway called from the kitchen, "What will you have to drink?" My reply was, "I thought letter perfect. Daiquiri, sir." "Good God, Karsh," Hemingway remonstrated, "at this hour of day?" Hemingway went on to say, "I don't drink while I write. You can't write serious stuff and drink." I suggested that he must be quite unlike Churchill in that respect. And he retorted, "Churchill is a writer of rhetoric, and to write rhetoric, you must drink. But that's not my trade." And here's a Hemingway most people have never seen, which is rather beautiful too. Okay. Steichen. Gorgeous, look at that face. To every branch of photography, Steichen has brought his own inventive genius and pioneered in establishing photography as an art. When I was a young and struggling photographer, I turned eagerly every month to his pages in the magazine Vanity Fair for inspiration. The first time I photographed this giant, during the Second World War, I was very nervous, and Steichen understanding this was especially encouraging. During the intervening years, Steichen's face took on the quality of an Old Testament prophet, and I was anxious to record what endless, restless experimentation, deep thought, and photographic innovation had etched. He was nearing his 90th year when this portrait was taken in 1967 at his home in West Reading, Connecticut. Over dinner, we talked about the future of photography and about the education of young photographers in particular. Steichen said, "Photography is both extremely difficult and extremely easy. to set a lens opening, to press a button. These are technical operations and can be learned. But to capture a mood or inner spirit demands a creative insight and a searching eye. I, too, have always hoped that young photographers would cultivate an interest in the humanities and become well-rounded human beings. We tell this to little students all the time, don't we? Open your eyes. Okay, Steichen. No prizes for this one either, really. But such a great portrait. I photographed Ali in 1970 as part of a series of young people for Look magazine. 1970. Muhammad Ali arrived at my New York studio with a breathless young editor trailing behind. They had jogged together from the Look offices, the young editor carrying Muhammad Ali's portable telephone, which Ali said kept him in constant contact with the world. It's big. Since the editor was a slight young man, I smiled to myself as I imagined this improbable duo and the incredulous stares of the passers-by as they made their way up Madison Avenue. The greatest and I talked about his triumphs, about patent medicine, about the commercials he was making, but there was for me no real contact. The pinstripe suit he wore for our sitting was chosen not for business, but to command the respect he rightly felt he deserved. Anyone?
Jacques Cousteau.
God. Good. At his specific request, I photographed Cousteau with his sons, Jean-Michel and Philippe. Here I am, he said, happy with my own sperm. And indeed, he was supremely pleased. Karsh, he said, you've taken a portrait of 3 relative strangers who went to the moon together. How much more wonderful would it be to photograph a father and 2 sons on a space mission? Because Cousteau had hoped that the 3 of them may one day work together on a space platform. What's the long-term basis for underwater research? Karsh asked Cousteau. It is the key to human survival. But he warned that man is gravely endangering this vital resource. For all land pollutants eventually find their way to the oceans, and we risk poisoning the sea forever just when we are learning her science, art, and philosophy, and how to live in her embrace. 40 years ago. GIF? It's not really a good GIF, is it? Okay, all right, final story. The one and only. Okay, let's see if we can make this one work. Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney greeted Nelson Mandela at the airport and accompanied him to the Chateau Laurier, which is where Mr. Karsh had his studio. We were waiting in the lobby and the introductions were made. When the session started an hour later, Mandela was warm and friendly, but obviously very tired. Karsh then told him a story about Pope John the 23rd. He had asked the pontiff, how many people work in the Vatican? The Pope smiled and replied, about half. Mandela looked a little blank. Suddenly he got the joke, slapped the table and roared with laughter, and everything about the sitting changed. Beautiful. Okay, story time's like, well, it's not really end of story time, just moving on. So I wanted to just not talk about pictures and stuff. I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about what we actually do now. So, how do you keep someone's legacy alive? As most of the people in the archive now are, most of them are dead, not all of them, but, we still like to make sure that people are aware of the images, that they license the images. So I wanted to just enlighten you a little bit about how that works and how we use the web, really. So I innocently answered the phone a few years ago, probably 6-7 years ago, to a picture editor. And she said, I'm doing a Google image search for Sir Ian Fleming, and I'm wondering if the first picture in the result is a Karsh. So it was not, and we hadn't photographed him, but I was really perturbed that this is how this person was going to be doing their photo research. And it made me realize that we at the estate need to find a way to get images into the search engine so that when someone is looking, they will find if we had Ian Fleming, and they would come back to us. So I launched a blog under one of my other headings, which is A Curator. which is a full-screen photography magazine, but it's also a blog where I publish news and stuff, all photography related. So I literally started the blog, and I thought, let's start getting our images indexed in properties that will more easily lead people to us. This is obviously Jonas Salk, created the polio vaccine. And so that's what I did. So I set out to do it. And eventually stuff gets indexed and we do start to show up. Where did I get to? So we have a good relationship with the Salk Institute. I've lost my place in my slides. Talk amongst yourselves for a nanosecond. Here we go. So depending on what events are going on around the world, I can, get more requests and so on. I keep an eye on what's happening in the news. So the New York Times did an article about Bernice Abbott, so I wanted to show our Bernice Abbott photograph. So it's a way next time someone's looking for her that they might find us in the search engines. I'll put things in my blog when I find random strangeness that probably, well, actually, this was donated to the National Portrait Gallery and a bunch of prints that Estrelita donated recently. But, things like Queen Elizabeth, who he photographed 5 times. She's going to have been the monarch now for longer than Queen Victoria, so she'll be the longest sitting monarch. Those kinds of things create additional interest in the images. And Churchill's going to be on the new £5 note in the UK next year, and there are all sorts of Churchill events going on. We'll get more basic editorial inquiries. Obviously, that business has changed a lot, but it is still out there, and people are still publishing books and so on. And you'd be surprised, actually, how many portraits of Ernest Hemingway are hanging in the background on movie sets. It's amazing. Quite regularly, I'll get a clearance for, on-set usage. Something's already been filmed, and they just happen to have, if they catch an image in the background, technically they have to license it and pay for it. So I use my blog. I find these just incredible, fantastic pictures. This is Tito with his strange, pipe cigarette thing. Has anyone ever seen that happen before outside of Yugoslavia? I don't know. It's wonderful, and it's all beautiful. So people die, so then I'll do a little obit, and I'm on the phone actually trying to call People Magazine and Time Magazine, see if they want to actually license images, and occasionally we do. I do tons and tons of pro bono, basically. So I do a lot of work with non-profits, and I work with the government. There's so many people that Karsh photographed that we're not always licensing, we're just granting rights and so on. So we're very close with the Churchill Centre over in the UK, and they love to use our images. They just made a new logo. They wanted to use a smiling shot, which I think is really sweet. So that's going to be on their letterhead and stuff. And these uses continue to cement Karsh's images in people's minds. There was a show at the Morgan Library here in New York. It was probably a couple of years ago now. And we did a lot with them. And it was wonderful just to see both of them. See, most people don't see the smiling version too. Recently, we did an online lightbox with Time/Life. Karsh photographed a great deal for both of those magazines, and we want to encourage them to keep using them too. And so for something like their website, we gave them a bunch of images. I curated an interview with them, and it was really successful. Here was a really interesting thing that happened probably 3 or 4 years ago. The lovely Michael Norsang, who's a photo editor at Esquire, called me to see if we had the Kennedy brothers. Michael is actually a Karsh fan. He grew up looking at magazines in his mom and dad's house that had Karsh images in. He was very happy. This is also the experience. People do have these kind of feelings about Karsh, and so many people met him or grew up with his work that when they realize the images are available and they have the opportunity to license them, they get really excited. So we didn't have them together, but we had these 3 gorgeous portraits. So we worked with Esquire. Their designer created this, and we did a really beautiful cover with them. So there are ways to keep people using the work if you're prepared to be flexible. And then Esquire actually gave us the rights to license the image if we want to in the future, which is really, really nice. And then things like, just knowing what's going on. Van Cleef and Arpels, they own this suite of jewelry that Princess Grace is wearing here, which is fantastic because they like to show the jewelry, and when they show the jewelry, they like to show a copy. So sometimes they just make a little tiny card that will go in an exhibition somewhere, and it just shows her wearing the set. I don't know why I picked jewelry, but things like this 1951 portrait of the Queen, this necklace showed up on Kate recently. So then suddenly, we can have an opportunity to sell pictures of the Queen wearing the original piece. I had the story on that. Missing it was Cartier necklace, which was a wedding present to the Queen in 1947 from the Nizam of Hyderabad, who was a king in India. Top fashion facts. You learn it here. All right, so we remember Nelson Mandela. When Nelson Mandela died, there was a real flurry of requests from what are left of magazines. Books come a little bit later, and a lot of people have already done their obits and so on. But Mandela was one of the few times in the recent years where it's, people are actually ringing me up, talking about exclusives and prices and so on. In the end, nobody actually wanted an exclusive use of the image. So he died on a Thursday. I went to bed. I woke up the following morning and had an email from Apple. And Apple wanted to use Nelson Mandela on their homepage. So I essentially spent a day back and forth with Apple, who are not licensing images for, lots and lots of money. They just wanted to do an homage to Mandela on the homepage. We went back and forth a lot because they basically wanted to do this. So they wanted to knock it out. And I was really conflicted. But it was Apple, and it's the homepage of Apple. And, sometimes I just have to make these decisions by myself. So I had a really stressful 24 hours. I said yes, I agreed to their terms, I signed all their paperwork. And then it blew my socks off when I finally saw it. And I think in situations like this, there's a good argument to allow somebody to alter the image. Problem being, of course, they don't credit. So now, I've let them change the image. There's no photo credit. Imagine saying that on behalf of something as important and fabulous as this. But actually, it was a really wonderful thing. And Mrs. Karsh and Mr. Fielder were really, really happy with it. And we figure, they kept it up for probably 3 weeks. So millions and millions of people around the world saw this photograph. So then I thought, well, what can I do to kind of make sure people do know that it's Karsh? So being a huge fan of things like Twitter, I monitored what people were saying about this because I knew people would be talking about it. And sure enough, they talked about it, and they talked about it a lot. It was a big deal for Apple to take their store off the homepage and throw this image up instead. So I would retweet and then respond and say, this image is by Yousuf Karsh for a few weeks. We do a lot of business with Canada Post, so they did a Mandela stamp. And then I'm always happy to let students and so on use the image. This one poster competition in South Africa. It's nice. Okay, sometimes things get weird. Sometimes things are bound to get weird, I suppose. I'll just go, does anyone know who this is?
Bernie Madoff.
It's Bernie Madoff. Does anyone know who Bernie Madoff is? I never remember people who don't know who Bernie Madoff is. Surely not that short memories. This is my life. I get a phone call from Vanity Fair and they say, we need you to sign an NDA and we want to come over there and discuss something with you. And I'm like, we won't sign an NDA about what? We can't tell you until you sign the NDA. Okay, fine. Basically, they came round to my office and opened up a manila envelope, and there's two prints of Bernie Madoff, 8x10 matte 8x10 prints. And Vanity Fair were interviewing his secretary, Eleanor, and Madoff had a portrait session. I didn't know, we really didn't know. We call the people who look up, we actually have like a card file for every single sitting. So I call the guy who's got the files. I'm like, look at them. I mean, what? Meanwhile, I'm thinking I missed all these opportunities because we didn't know we had him. 15,000 sittings. And sure enough, Mrs. Madoff had treated Bernie to a session, I think it was 1986. And good old Bern had gone and made copies and he was giving them to people. So he'd actually made some like 4x6 prints or something as well. Excuse me. Absolutely wonderful. I ended up with Eleanor came round to my house. We had a fantastic chat. We talked about Madoff and what she thought was going on and so on. I even tried to help her sell the prints. We tried to sell them at auction. I was trying to find John Waters. Thought maybe we could sell him these Madoff prints. Are really funny. Anyway, oh yeah. Look at that innocent face. Here's one of my all-time faves, which you can actually sort of probably just about read from here. But yeah, so Jerry Fielder gets an email from some tattoo artist in England saying, I just got my mate to let me tattoo this picture on him. And they hadn't even realized what it was or who it was. I sort of reverse engineered it, and I Googled famous portrait photographers or something, and sure enough, Yousuf was on page 1, and it was that picture. So I should, just for a laugh, I should have contacted him and said, permanent, that's perpetual rights, world rights. I don't know what language you speak. It might as well be all languages. Should have licensed it accordingly. Really classic, though. I pick my battles. This I find just revolting and annoying. This is just hilarious. That actually happened. That was a thing that tried to happen. I said no. I said no to this one too, although I was tempted. Einstein with an iPod, not listening to Mozart. And then, of course, proper uses where I've had so many people do bad things with the images, cut them heads off and so on, that I do ask people to just check with me now before they do anything. So I've made them quite nervous. This kind of thing I think is fine. It's fairly respectful. I even let a Churchill book cover go recently where I just thought the text was all over his face, but it wasn't. We'd seen worse, let's put it like that. Like this, for example. Don't laugh. Don't laugh, go, oh, grrr, hideous, terrible thing. Stop it. Is that Deborah? Are you laughing? I'm having a word with you later. This really annoys me. I don't know why. I find it so tasteless. Does anyone know this story? This photographer did a whole series of recreations of some of the most iconic images with Johnny Malkovich. And Johnny's in all of them. And I hate it. I'm going to move on. You guys can look it up if you're interested, but I really hate it. And I mean, he's got galleries selling limited edition prints of this stuff. So fine, if it's a meme online, that's funny, one thing. But now he's selling prints for more than probably we get for an actual Hemingway. Yeah. And then there's stuff like this where, I sort of have a worldwide Karsh police. So people do contact us when they see things that they think look a bit dodgy, and this was definitely dodgy. Moleskine found this online and used it. It was a little bit of a hard struggle, but I did get them to pay a chunk of change for it, and lots of apologies, and taught them a hard lesson in copyright and clearances. So yeah, as I said, I use Twitter a lot, and I see what people are talking about. I try and follow up with things, obviously people are using the term Karsh and I'm finding them. There's so much stuff out there that I have no idea about. And there are, I can't even imagine how many Tumblrs and Pinterest pages and blogs and so on and so forth that people are using Karsh images, but people kind of like the fact that they're using Karsh, so they do credit him, and that's kind of, I find that to be okay. I busted a handbag company and just happened to find using 3 images by Karsh to sell handbags for Mother's Day. And who's going to call a lawyer? I use Twitter. I just start shaming them on Twitter, and they immediately took it down and apologized. So, I find those tools really handy. Between probably Flickr, Pinterest, I don't know. But I do think often they send traffic back to us, and again, provided they're crediting, I don't really have a problem with it. So really winding down on top of what we actually do to promote the images. Oh, this was a good one I just found. And Giacometti. Mrs. Karsh also donates quite a lot of prints to organizations. She has many philanthropic endowments. So, you know, things like this go on too. And then once these organizations have our images in their websites, that's more search results. So next time someone searches for Charles Schulz images, there's a better chance that they'll come back and find the Yousuf Karsh. That's my favorite, Mrs. Karsh with Snoopy. Like, what's better than that? Nothing. Trust me.
He's a dog.
Nothing. There she is, in all her glory. So, she donated 100 prints, I think, last year to the National Portrait Gallery. And that was a fabulous exhibition. Okay. Now, this is the kind of thing that you can never buy. We got a crater. There is a meteor crater on Mercury has been named Yousuf Karsh. I mean, I can't buy that kind of publicity for love nor money, no matter how many blog posts I make. The only thing is they did not come and ask us about privacy rights, so I'm still not sure about that. And that's basically what happens, you know, on a daily basis around the Karsh archive. And the other thing is I get to come and talk to people like you about Mr. Karsh, so thanks ever so much for listening. Really appreciate it.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.